where we left off, we were doing digital inking, which is just like traditional inking, but using digital tools, right? Which has certain advantages on top of our sketch. And remember, a really important step that you should not forget is to modify your sketch before you start inking. Just play with its proportions. All I did was use warp. You could also, if I was really unconfident, or not confident about some aspect of this, like how the tail looks or something, I could always composite in elements here as well before I digitally ink. And then I onion skinned. I have this white layer that's set to 70% opacity. All of that's locked. And then on a new layer, I have my digital inking raster image. So now I can see what that looks like by making a new layer and making that 100% white. And now I can see my clean inking. Now, because we're at a high enough resolution, 11 by 14 inches by 350 pixels per inch, this is made of pixels, and you can see where there's little wobbles in it, but that looks pretty darn clean. For instance, if I was going to ink this by hand, and I used to make that an option, but it's just not worth it anymore because it takes too long and it's not as good as doing this. But I used to make it an option where you could use tracing vellum and ink with a Sharpie or permanent ink. And then we would scan that, and then we would bring that into Photoshop and clean that up, and then we would move from there like I'm going to show you from here to turn it into a vector. And when I scan my inked drawings, the line art, I scan them at 650 pixels per inch. Because you want the pixels to catch every subtlety in your line, right? But that takes a lot of memory. So now what I'm going to do, let's say I was finished with my digital inking in Photoshop as a raster, and I like those brush tools, and I'm at 100% opacity, and I'm using the smoothing function, and I'm using either a technical size brush that's locked, or I'm using a pressure sensitive brush that can be more gestural. I have the locked brush for the bones here, and I have the gestural brush for the outside of the flames. Now what do I do? Now I save it, just update it, and I'm going to save it as a JPEG, as an online file type. But not to post to Canvas, but rather to bring into Adobe Illustrator. So these kind of files, these are transitional files. I label them test files. And I still save them, but they don't get posted anywhere. They're just used to move from one program to another. So you can see my test file here. I usually mark them gray. And now that test file, I'm going to right click. So my PSD of my refined sketch, I'll mark green, because I mark PSDs green, they're a working format. But that gray JPEG of my line art with just white behind it as a JPEG, I'm going to open it with Adobe Illustrator. Now remember, this is a raster file that I'm opening in a vector program. All right, close that. So when I look at it, I'll see the pixels. And because we used it at 100% black, but we used the brush tool, not the pencil tool, it gave us an anti-aliased edge. A slightly gradation to soften the edge slightly, which is very similar to how actual permanent ink would scan as well once you've cleaned it up. Okay, what do I do in Illustrator now? This is called vectorizing. Within Illustrator itself, it's called image tracing. But the overall term is vectorize, to turn something that's raster into a vector. And when I show you this, you're going to say, why didn't you show us this for the last project? It was so hard making shapes in Illustrator, using the pen tool and the pencil tool. Well, because you need to know those to correct anything that goes wrong here. Okay? So I'm showing it to you now because now you're ready to appreciate it. So I'm going to click with the large selection tool on the image, and you'll see just the corners show up. and I'll see it in my layers. There's my image. Then I go to properties. And once it's selected, under properties, you will see an option for image trace. And if you don't see it there, which you would also find it under window. So image trace, you click on that and it will give you a lot of default settings. The default setting I always use and always recommend is black and white logo. Okay? That's going to give you kind of the cleanest results for the things we're using it for. I do not like to vectorize color images. Right? You'll see the limits of vectorizing really quickly when you do it with color. So we do it with just black. Now, notice it didn't say black logo. It said black and white logo. So that's important. Now, it says black and white. We click on the advanced panels for the options. And right now, it is previewing for us. If it's not, make sure the preview is checked. And now, those pixels that I painted in Adobe Photoshop are now, it keeps going to the center of the image. But now they are vectors. They are perfectly clean. Pretty nice, but I'm not done because this is just a preview. So what do I need to do? Well, I'm going to click on the advanced option here, the little drop down, and you have to say ignore the background color. Otherwise, you're going to get white vector shapes and black vector shapes. Okay? So I ignore the color. And now that preview is only black lines. But it's still a preview. So why do we have the preview? Well, I can set this to be more sensitive or less sensitive. So if I say more, the lines will get thicker, but the details will get less distinct. So that fixed some of the bumps, right, in my inking. But it also made everything a little bit chunkier. And maybe I like that or maybe I don't like that. You can also play with the corners, with the noise. Noise is only if there's like little stray bits that you might not want. But once you're happy with it, you're going to hit expand. I don't know why it's expand. It always has been in Illustrator. But expand is the final step for saying turn it into a vector. So expand the pixels out into anchor points. Right. So now I have those anchor points. So here's the issue I have with image tracing. And I'll admit, it did a pretty darn good job with this. But because I inked it in Photoshop first, there might be little issues like that, right? Because Photoshop makes it hard to redo something and hard to erase it without really kind of ruining the flow. So what do I have to do? Well, now that it's a vector, I have to use those vector skills. And you know, my favorite tool is the pencil tool to redraw. So I'm going to use the pencil tool. I'm going to set it to be more smooth than accurate by double clicking on it. I'm going to see the anchor points and I'm going to start on the path and end on the path to kind of redraw these. But this is a pain. This is why it's a decent method and maybe the one you want to use to get vector line art for your spot illustration. But there's also a considerable amount of editing and kind of proofing at the end that are necessary. Also, notice this one didn't touch, right? And I want it to touch, so I need to draw a line that extends beyond it. And then these are the teeth, so all that kind of thing. So my preferred method is to just ink the thing in Adobe Illustrator. And this is actually the most popular videos on these tutorials internationally, is how I show people how to use the Blob brush in Illustrator. So I think it's a very underappreciated tool in Illustrator. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. I'll say save as. I'm just going to keep it as a test because this is showing you how you can vectorize something that you already digitally inked in Photoshop or Photopea as a raster. And I'm just going to save it as an AI file to the desktop, but it will say test. And then I'll close it. And because it's a working file, an AI file, I'll mark that green. But now I'm going to take my sketch and I'm going to set up for digital inking in the second way. So where did I save my sketch? Here it is. No, where is it? The PSD. So I already took my sketch and I opened it in Photoshop in order to alter it a little bit. I still want to do that, no matter what method. But now I'm going to save this as a JPEG. And I'm just going to call this sketch reference for Illustrator. All right. And I didn't save it as a JPEG. I saved it as a PSD, but I'll just save a copy and then say JPEG. Okay, this is also a transitional file, right? And it's good that it's at a high resolution. So there it is. Now, just like the refined sketch for our vector graphics that we did for the last project, I'm going to open this sketch up in Illustrator. And then just like we did with the last project, it's good repetition, I'm going to double click on the layer and I'm going to onion skin it, dim the image, and I'm going to dim it to 30%. So this will set it up just like I did in Photoshop, just in a different method. Then I'm going to lock that layer, make a new layer on top. This is going to be for my vector line art. And then the tool we use to digitally ink in Illustrator is not the paintbrush tool. The paintbrush tool is actually my least favorite tool in Illustrator because it's based on strokes. And strokes are amateurish at best. So instead, you want to find where the brush tool is. It's also where the pencil is, usually. And you want to find what's called the Blob brush. Shift B is the shortcut to it. The Blob brush tool is my second favorite tool in Illustrator. What's my first favorite tool? The pencil, because you always will need to fix something and redraw. But the Blob brush tool is just like the paintbrush in Photoshop. And you double click it and you can set it to be more smooth or accurate, just like smoothing in Photoshop, right? And you can set its size, but it's not in pixel size, it's in point size, like it was a typeface. And then you can set the Blob brush. This is what's magical about it, because you're using a tablet, just like we did in Photoshop. I definitely recommend a tablet. You can set it to be pressure sensitive. And then for some reason, we have to say how much variation we want in the pressure sensitivity. And I just always go all the way. So I'm going to try 35 point, and then I'm going to see. And maybe that's a little big. But let's see. Now, first of all, because it's a vector, even though it's smoothing as I go, this will be much more reactive to me. It's not going to slow it down as much because it's not processing as much information. And it's going to do black with a white stroke. I don't want the white stroke, so I'm going to turn off the stroke. And then when I start painting, I'm going to get a sense really quickly how thick that is. And that's too thick. So I just dial back my size. Okay. That's still pretty thick. Now what's funny is point sizes are different than pixels because there's actually no limit to it. So even if I limit it to like 5 points, I'm trying 8, it actually can go a lot smaller than that. It just can't go bigger than that, right? It's got kind of an infinite range. Like if I barely press, I can do tiny, tiny, tiny things, right? That are all individual vectors. Yeah, this is feeling better. So this is going to be for my gestural, lines on the outside. You can see how clean that is. And then what's great about the Blob brush is this is its own path with an inside and outside edge, right? But I can just paint right on top of it and it will add to it. That's why it's called a blob brush. Like if you spill ink, how the ink blobs flow into each other and all be